Hello and welcome to WorldCanvass from International Programs at the University of Iowa. I'm Joan Kerr. We're here in the Senate Chamber of the Old Capitol Museum on the campus of the University of Iowa. Very happy to have you with us, whether you're here in the audience, in the live location, or watching on television. My guests tonight are award-winning filmmaker Steve Maing, two faculty members of the University of Iowa, Lisa Weaver and Professor Wenfang Tang. Our topic for this four-part series is A Century of Film in the Public Sphere, and this is the fourth and final episode, so I'm glad you can be with us. Just next to me is Steve Maing, who is a New York-based filmmaker and artist, a fellow of the Sundance Institute's documentary film program, and a grant recipient of the MacArthur Foundation, New York State Council on the Arts, and the Independent Television Service. High-tech, low-life, filmed in China, Taiwan, Romania, and Germany, has won numerous awards, including Best Documentary at the Independent Film Festival of Boston and the Little Rock Film Festival, and Best Cinematography at the Woods Hole Film Festival. And most recently, Steve Maing was awarded a 2013 Grierson Award, one of the UK's highest documentary honors in the category Best Newcomer Documentary. And so, Steve Maing, real pleasure to have you here with us. Thanks.
Thanks for having me.
Many have seen Steve Maing's film High Tech, Low Life. It had a showing here on the campus of the University of Iowa and was also on public television here recently. Lisa Weaver is a former China-based CNN reporter, and she currently teaches in the University of Iowa School of Journalism and Mass Communications. Great to have you, Lisa. And Professor Wenfang Tang is on the end. He teaches in the University of Iowa Department of Political Science. Very good to have you here, Wenfang. Thanks.
Thank you.
Yeah. So I'm very excited to have the three of you here in this part of the discussion. As you know, throughout the series, we've been talking about this last century of film and filmmaking. We've been looking at ways making films has changed, watching films has changed, and reflecting a little bit on the cultural impact of storytelling through film. In this segment, we're trying to get at something which is sort of revolves around challenging the status quo and kind of looking at the way people are taking in films of one sort or another through an era when we can have 2-minute films shown through social media, we can share links, we can see all kinds of things kind of in underground ways, and then also very popular films that draw an audience and create common discussion. High Tech, Low Life, this film that Steve Maing recently did, I mentioned, has been shown here on the university campus and had a good crowd and a spirited discussion afterward. And I'd like to start first, Steve, with you. First ask you to tell us a little bit about who you are, where you came from, and then why this film is the film you made over a 5-year period in your life. So where did you grow up?
I grew up in New Jersey.
New Jersey, yeah. So you went to film school, or you just learned how to make films on your own?
Well, I started out in an engineering program, and then was, I guess, interested in, I liked problem solving and the design aspect of that. But I was always thinking about storytelling, I guess, like a lot of people in this room. It sort of naturally or clumsily led to filmmaking, and I found that it not only had sort of a design aspect and exciting problems to solve, but there's also a narrative element, and you could mix a lot of different kinds of questions and challenges into one project, and then ask a whole other set of questions on your next project, and that was really an exciting idea to me.
Well, in the storytelling, I only have this one film to refer to in terms of the work you've done, but High Tech, Low Life, I'd love to have you just give us a sketch of what this film is about, but from my perspective, it's very humane. There's a real sort of, there's a very personal touch, I think, to what you present to an audience, and I loved that about it. And I know that even within engineering, which we might think of as just, people working on paper and whatnot. I know engineers are also passionate about what happens in life and what their products do to people in the end. But filmmaking is something very different. You can put your heart into it in a way that other people can actually see.
Yeah, well, I mean, I was a crappy engineer, so that wasn't working out.
Great.
So that sort of resolve itself. But
so tell us about this story.
yeah, the story was just, I mean, in a way, it's like a bit mundane. It was just a personal curiosity. I had born out of reading an article and then just doing some very light, unguided, unfocused research around it. And you know, there are so many reasons why we just sort of fall down a Google rabbit hole. And so this particular one led me to Zola, the main character, who would be the main character's website. Just the confluence of like the article that had initially sparked my interest about this eminent domain case in the city of Chongqing, and then seeing this really high contrast as far as who he was and how he was portraying himself on his personal website was just, you know, interesting, intriguing to me, and it really sparked my imagination as far as like this great amount of possibility in this young guy, and at the same time, you know, pretty meaningful stakes that he was taking on. You know, that in itself is a great kind of foundation to then tell a story. And so, you know, he was really excited by the idea when we just started chatting over email about sharing his story with the filmmaker. It just took off from there.
Yeah. And so, for people who haven't seen the film, there are two central characters, and both are bloggers in China. Zola, who was just mentioned here, is a younger man who really seems to be ambitious in terms of making something of himself, becoming known, becoming maybe sort of a celebrity. And the other fellow is somewhat older, and also a blogger, travels all over China, usually on his bike. And or at least in the film, we see him on his bike going great distances. And he seems to be very anxious to bring things that perhaps the government doesn't want people to see debated in public to some, you know, larger audience.
I think Steve is a little bit underselling how rich the film is. You're right. There are two main characters. You're only talking about one of them.
Sure.
And I thought that was very interesting. You're really portraying two completely different types of bloggers, two different types of people who use social media. One is this kind of the younger person from rural China selling vegetables in the market, but trying to make it himself, and totally self-centered, would do anything to stir up some kind of a social movement. Then you have the older person, blogger, who's feeling a lot of social responsibility, and I kind of like the older character a lot better because he's more complicated. He has both sides. He sometimes challenged the regime, but oftentimes he tried to fill in the gaps, like what the government neglects, or the social groups of people who are neglected in Chinese society. He works very hard to meet their needs.
Yeah, I mean, ostensibly, it's on the surface about these two bloggers from different generations and who are taking upon themselves with the use of social media and sort of that Web 1.0 output, challenging the status quo by reporting uncensored news stories. But what really interested me was not that it was about, you know, I wasn't particularly interested or researching blogging or new media or sort of social media activism, but that there were these sort of associative meanings to their stories, and that in the juxtaposition, one exciting thing to discover in production or in the filming and editing was that, you know, there's also this kind of like generational changing the guards happening, and that there is this kind of conflict with this youthful generation trying to reconcile this Maoist past that they maybe didn't quite understand, but, you know, with an individual like Zola was, you know, kind of instinctively, reactively pushing back against anything paternalistic, whether that's his parents or the Chinese government, the censors, his local police. And then even as in the scene of the film when the two meet, even Tiger, you know, debating this idea of like collectivism and individuality and the importance of individualism as far as, in his words, dispelling the communist mindset within people, and that being by being selfish, by being self-indulgent, that you might in some way break down this communist kind of Marxist encoding that he's without his choice had inherited.
Yeah.
And so it was exciting to me to just learn about Zola's story, but then see that story activated in an entirely different way when we injected another character's narrative into that.
Well, and it's interesting to hear you say that you didn't really start out looking at this as a story where you could talk about bloggers and social media, because really we learned so much about the kind of immediate response they got to postings. You see Zola at one point sitting in front of the computer saying, "Oh, look at how many responses there are here," and obviously this other fellow, Tiger Temple, says that he receives requests from people who are feeling lost, nobody to turn to who tell their story. These requests come to him, and in some cases he moves on. In terms of what you know about citizen journalism in China, Lisa, how closely would it relate to what we saw in the film?
Very closely.
Yeah.
Very closely. The topics that people were protesting about, which include forced relocation or having to leave their homes because there's no really land ownership in the sense that we have in this country. What I used to call, when I lived there, sort of bread and butter issues, mostly not calling for, bringing down the Communist Party or articulating, sort of political opposition for the most part, just, sort of lively life issues. In the time that I lived there, these groups would often call the foreign journalists if they were doing, protesting something, because they knew the Chinese, for the most part, journalists wouldn't go. And so that was the way that foreign-based media, and I appreciated the scenes in the movie with the French journalists trying to get the shot of Zola in the alleyway. We learned about a lot of protests through the groups that would call us, and I suppose also blog. I think the social media really kicked into high gear after I left, and I stay in touch with some of the people at CNN now, and one friend of mine, a producer who's been there for years, says he checks the microblogs frequently. He has to stay on top of a lot of social media just to see what is being discussed, because there are so many tips to stories. There are also times that the mainstream news media in China does pay attention for usually brief periods of time on issues that are sensitive until they're told to back off. But then when they are told to back off, the citizen journalists keep going.
You had a thought, Wenfang, that which you expressed after the film screening. It was a question to Steve about why he didn't follow this one particular incident to what might be seen as more of a conclusion, and Steve's explanation was that really wasn't what you were most interested in terms of the film. You were interested in these two characters, not necessarily following one incident to a different kind of conclusion. But why would that have been important?
Well, it shows one of the two most important roles of social media, actually. The part that I wish the movie covered a little more is this huge protest stirred up by the younger person's blogging about this girl who was drowned and who was allegedly raped. So there's no real answer to that question, whether she was raped or not. But however, there was a protest that gathered over 100,000 people. So that really shows how much the internet can do. I think that's related to, I'm thinking about these two different functions social media can play. One, that in an authoritarian society like China, which is described by a political scientist a long time ago as a society with a strong thumb but weak fingers, meaning the government is really strong, but when it comes to specific policies. Many of these policies are neglected and not well implemented, right? So social media can either challenge the thought, right? Or it can strengthen the thinkers. I think in the case of the younger blogger, he's clearly trying to challenge the thought, right? Cut the thought. Right? But for the older blogger, I think he sometimes touches the thumb, and most of the time he's trying to strengthen fingers. So I think these are two different types of people, and they're serving two different functions in terms of social media in China.
Well, Steve, I was wondering about the fact that the viewer of the film has to sort of stop and remember that you're there shooting what we're seeing. That's a wonderful thing that happens with films. Very often you forget that there's this whole film crew or an individual person with a camera there. It's just like it's you there. Well, you were shooting these moments when, for example, the younger guy was afraid that he was being tailed, or somebody was going to prevent him from going forward. And then also at a moment in the film when with the older blogger, he was being detained by the police and whatnot. So you were there shooting these things. How much did that influence, do you think, anything that happened?
How much did it influence? I think your presence entirely influences it.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate because we're making so many kind of like micro decisions along the way, and trying to consider and maintain lots of options as far as the material we're collecting and to not tamp it down. And that's the biggest struggle, that the presence of the filmmaker is altering the reality entirely. And
Was the detention scene shot with a hidden camera?
that actually, when I was not the shooter of it, so that was material that Tiger had a friend who had shown up and she had a camera in her bag.
Okay, so the police didn't know that anybody was filming that.
I think they were aware at the same time because she in the entirety of that material becomes a little bit bolder about that. But she, this woman, Ming Shu, who is a filmmaker in her own right, had just luckily happened to have her camera at the time when Tiger had sent out some texts that the police were coming in, that they had come to take him away. So, there are a lot of things that happen in a film that you can't always include. One part of his story was that he ran around at times and collaborated with a team of activists and other bloggers, and very casual. He didn't even like to call it a team, but that was something that we weren't fully allowed to show. And so a lot of the efforts that they do, they don't want to seem like organized activism, and so we had to sort of omit and not tell the complete story. And that's that when you talk about sort of like the omission of material and information, it comes down to the needs of the narrative and having to make these hard decisions about what the most functional narrative is, but one that isn't going to result in sort of discourse or dissertation, but inspires more questions and more discussion. And so
I know the movie is about censorship, but I just want to bring another point that I thought was very interesting in the movie. That's the contrast between censorship, that's the ongoing theme in the movie, and this guy in Beijing on the street cursing the government. Right? And the young blogger coming from rural China was shocked, saying, wow, people are so open in Beijing. They can openly criticize the government. I thought it was a very interesting contrast. If you don't show that part, people would think that China is the same as 30 years ago when under Mao. China has gone a long way in terms of freedom of speech, even with this censorship. And that also reminds me another very recent study done by Harvard political scientist Gary King. He and his co-authors studied Chinese internet discussion, online discussion, they found that as long as you don't advocate collective action and people are left alone, people can be highly critical. So there's different layers of this censorship, I think, in China. I thought the movie partly reflects some of
I
that.
mean, there's such an entirely complicated and important conversation to have about censorship. You know, there's a much sort of debated idea that the government is actually in total control of all the messaging that comes out. That the social media is this entirely convenient tool to sort of get a gauge on sort of public sentiment, but then also to use as this pressure valve, and that the line is intentionally blurry and gray and just constantly shifting, because the government knows that to maintain control and authority, there should at times be allowed moments of vent, where people are allowed to vent, and at the same time, convenient things can happen. So some corrupt local politician in a distant province can be outed for whatever malfeasance through social media, and that's something the central government wouldn't necessarily have a problem with, But
At the same time, they have to be careful, because if it can mobilize, they're also that government is very sensitive to anything that would mobilize people to connect the dots. If it's an individual voice in extremism here and there, that's one thing, but if everyone gets on the same page and organizes a protest using social media, that's what they really worry about.
Yeah, I'm sure you're aware of Rebecca McKinnon, but she, she had given Zola some advice at one point, that of course there's like the 3 T's in the F, Tiananmen, Tibet, and Taiwan, and then Falun Gong. Like, be careful when you discuss those, and most Chinese obviously understand it. But then the most important thing is, don't be cautious of mobilizing, a collective action accidentally in your writing.
In terms of collective action, the internet can go both ways. You can mobilize people to organize people, make people more politically active, give people information, and challenge the government, supervise the government, and promote civil society, right? But it also can go the other way by stirring up mob mentality. And in Chinese, they call that human flash search engine. That in several cases, netizens, internet users, try to expose people's privacy, those people who disagree with, right? One good example is the Chinese student who was advocating more balanced discussion with Tibet, and her family in China was mocked. They found out where she lived, and her mother was harassed. So that kind of role internet can also play in China. If you don't have a good legal procedure, well-established institutions in civil society, so that can cause a lot of damage in society.
Wow. Well, we're coming to the end of the segment, but I wanted to just take a minute and tell you that I thought the cinematography, the filming of this film, was just so beautiful. So many of the scenes, particularly I thought the world scenes and the nighttime shot inside the family home, all very, very little light, but incredibly striking images that will stay with me for a long, long time.
Not the pollution scenes.
The pollution wasn't as pretty perhaps, but nonetheless, it was really wonderfully shot. And what are you most proud of with this film?
Actually, I look back and I beat myself up over a lot of decisions. And it's this process of discovery. So, I mean, that's a complicated question. Because I look back and I see all the things I would like to, explore differently. But it's for another film. But I'm most proud of just getting to know those guys. I mean, that was an incredibly rare opportunity to tell them over the number of years that I did. And, you don't get, the camera is one thing, it's disarming, it makes people talk, they share things with you that you would have never realized, or maybe arrived at in regular interactions. But then, you compound that with 2 people who have that kind of idea of like agency, and that they're these go-getters that want to go and expose things in the world, and it was electric. I mean, situation after situation astounded me and made me totally depressed. And feel helpless and powerless for them, for their subjects. And so, I mean, it was like literally the most profound and upsetting and exciting experience. And so you look back at the film, it's like 80-minute, 90-minute documentary, like it does no justice to what you saw.
Yeah.
And that tears you up a little bit, but you just go and keep trying.
Well, I am so grateful to you for spending this time with us, and to you, Lisa Beaver, and to you, Wenfang Tang. So this is Stephen Maing, and I want to say thank you also to the Department of Cinema and Comparative Literature for putting together a series of events surrounding Steve's visit. So this has been really exciting for me. Thank you very much. And this is the fourth part of a four-part series. You can find all of it on the YouTube channel, also on International Programs website, international.uiowa.edu, and on iTunes, and also on the Public Radio Exchange. Thank you for being with us tonight, and I hope you can join us next time when our topic is Child Protection, a Global Responsibility. For UI International Programs, I'm Joan Kerr, and see you next time. Good night.